Good morning. Welcome to another conversation on the Worthy for 30 podcast. I am elated to introduce my next guest, two individuals you may remember from previous conversations, Dan Reich and B.A. Van Sise. I'm elated to introduce Congressman Josh Gottheimer of the 5th District here in New Jersey to talk about a very important issue, which is combating anti-Semitism. So what I want to do is I want to set the floor with regards to why combating anti-Semitism is so important and why I want to make it a central pillar of this podcast platform. 2021, the Defamation-League said that anti-Semitic attacks reached a record number. 22, 23, we're seeing an escalation in anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks on the Jewish community. So the first question I want to ask the panel, starting with you, Congressman Gottheimer, is why, for the people who are listening at home, who will eventually be listening at home, why should combating anti-Semitism be an important issue for them to partake and to help the Jewish community combating?
Well, and first of all, thank you for having me and everyone else here and bringing up this topic, because I think the number one reason, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, is dealing with hate and division in the country. And whether regardless of if you're a Jewish American who's been targeted in the past with, as you pointed out, anti-Semitism at its highest levels on record around the country, hate levels at some of the highest records we've ever recorded in the country, and where I'm from in New Jersey, the second highest anti-Semitic incidents last year in the country. So it's out there. The problem is that it bleeds over to, if you're targeting Jews today, it's unfortunately every other minority tomorrow, and or vice versa. And we've seen in the last years, as with the explosion of social media and of course cable news and just general people living in smaller microcosms, people being fed information all day long to rile them up. We've seen this explosion of hate, which then of course spills over to every other part of society, and it leads to a general division in the country. That the only people who win are frankly the government of China and Russia, who literally spend every day looking for ways to divide us up so that we attack one another instead of coming together as a country and getting things done that we need to get done as a country, and making people feel less safe. If you're Irish, right, you and an Irish Catholic being attacked the same way that Jewish Americans or Muslims or obviously Black or Latinos can be attacked in the same way. So that's why I think all of us have to address.
Thank you. And Dan, from your perspective, again, why should the listeners at home really help the Jewish community combat anti-Semitism?
I totally agree with everything the Congressman said. It's like anti-Semitism, racism. I mean, they're all cousins and branches of the same tree. But the thing all of these issues have in common is it disrupts the moral fiber of community and in our case, the country. And when that happens, just everything breaks down, and you can't have a productive society that gets anything done because we're too busy hating each other and pursuing acts of violence and anti-Semitism. So I totally agree. It is this is the single biggest issue that if solved, I think sets the stage for a country that can be productive and good again, for lack of a better word.
Excellent. And BA, you have a unique perspective. You recently came out with a book, Invited to Life. You've received some hate mail in response to that because of this book and your work. Love to get your perspective as well.
So fundamentally, I think that it's important for the general public. And again, I make work for general public. I think it's important because it's symptomatic of a larger function. Jews are 1% of the population, less. But you're talking about the same causation that you see, as the Congressman mentioned, with every single group you could talk about. It always comes back to othering. And so fundamentally, whenever you are allowed to other some group, make them villains, make them scapegoats, it is an entryway to every single other group. I don't necessarily agree with Congressman. There's a lot of folks chasing around the Irish, but certainly you're talking about people who practice Islam in this country, people who are of any of a number of adjectives in this country. It's indicative of sort of these larger forces that always come back to othering and lack of education.
Gotcha. All right. Again, thank you for setting the tone for this conversation. Congressman, with regards to combating anti-Semitism, I know the White House, specifically President Biden, has made combating anti-Semitism a top priority. for his administration. He assembled a task force at the end of 22 to combat anti-Semitism. If you were to put yourself in the White House's shoes, not just President Biden, what does success look like in year one from your perspective?
Well, I think when the White House brings people together, it's to really take on an all-of-government approach, right? What are all the instruments we can bring to bear to fight hate and anti-Semitism? We've seen, as we've talked about, with an explosion of incidents, both online and in communities near the one I live in a recent Molotov cocktail at a synagogue. But that's just, unfortunately, one of a weekly incident I hear about, of swastikas. And I'm sure you all read about these incidents as well. And BA, what I mean by Irish Catholics, I mean like the general, there's just comments that are made, glib comments that are made, things that are made against any community online. It breeds over to, and people feel more comfortable. The things that I see on my social media page when I look at the comments, which I tend to avoid. But the number I really only see when there's a real actionable threat, and that's unfortunately way too often. And people just throw out things like comments about Benjamins and stop. You want to go back to Israel, and you work for the United States, not Israel. Those kind of comments just become, unfortunately, people get numb to them. They become acceptable, or they don't believe in the Holocaust and make comments about that as well. And what I worry about, just like other communities have been targeted, and I think this is the White House's broad mission, is to what are there things we can be doing from an education perspective in communities with law enforcement, and making sure or investigations that we're bringing all of these pieces and different groups to the table to have a smart conversation about what we can do.
Gotcha. And again, it's that education. It's really about that one-to-one at a grassroots level. How do we educate? How do we extinguish ignorance by, again, making the proactive choice to have these conversations, to bring people together who may not know, that some of these tropes about Jews are used as a baton for vitriol and for hate. And with regards to anti-Semitic attacks, Congressman, you mentioned a temple near Tamid, which is in my backyard in Bloomfield, where there was a failed Molotov cocktail attack. And it's funny, I was talking to BA and Dan before we recorded, and sometimes anti-Semitism. We talk about anti-Semitism, and it really is in the periphery, and it won't happen in my neighborhood, right? Yes, we need to work against it, but it hasn't happened to me, so it's not a mainstream or mainstream conversation yet. But again, this Molotov cocktail again woke me up a little bit more than I already am about the dangers of letting anti-Semitism fester. You met with Rabbi Katz, temple leadership, and what was interesting in your press release that I read is that I ask everyone to please stay vigilant and continue to look out for one another. It's up to you to stand up and fight back against this drastic and dangerous rise in anti-Semitism. So, how do you envision, Congressman, the listeners at home with regards to those words about, again, combating anti-Semitism at a grassroots level?
Well, I think the vigilance point, Eric, and unfortunately, you got to keep your eyes open in general, whether you're at shul or whether you're just in your neighborhood, and make sure that and again, not just targeted at Jews, but against any group. If you see and are threats, just make sure you flag them, and for law enforcement. And in the case, thank God, in the temple, like a lot of our temples and a lot of religious institutions, with support that we've given on nonprofit security grants, have taken measures like protecting doors and cameras and ballasts and others, and other measures which I think are critically important at our religious institutions to protect religious freedom and protect our students and young people at parochial schools. Right, those are all things we need to do, but we just all have to. Unfortunately, just if you remember, after 9/11, we kept our eye. Everyone just felt at a heightened alert. I think we're at a moment here in our history where we've got to have a heightened alert and watch out what people say on social media, what they target. And, there's one thing about free expression and a whole other thing when you cross the line. And it's hard. You see these incidents that happen and you write and you think, was there a sign that I should have paid attention to? Listen, it's very hard to know. And I'm not in law enforcement. I don't know all the signs, but there's things that you see a flag on, and we have to look out for one another. And I know law enforcement, in ways that they never have had to before. And it's overwhelming. You look at the threat level at the Capitol, and like the number of threats that are targeted a year have gone from a few hundred to 8 or 10,000 a year, right? I mean, just in the last few years, when people now feel like it's a free-for-all to say what you want. And that's
Okay,
all. And that's what
excellent.
I mean.
Again, just remaining vigilant. Again, if you see something, again, using New York City subway parlance, say something, because again, you don't know if someone's going to follow through on that threat. Again, thank you, Congressman. BA, with regards to the Petapixel article that you recently wrote about the hate mail that you received, how, again, based on that, based on the content of the hate mail that you received. One, can you at least at a high level provide us with a glimpse on of what the tenor is, and two, why you're taking this extremely seriously, even though that a lot of this, again, hate mail is just random, as you will. So yeah, love to again get your perspective.
So I'll try. I know that everyone's time is a little brief today, so I'll be as quick as I can with it. Since the book came out, I've received about 24 pieces of hate mail, some of it threatening, some of it's death threats, some of it's just crazy stuff. And again, I did not make a particularly salacious title. I wrote a book about the American lives of Holocaust survivors. Just so happened that it piqued the interest of some white supremacists because I have a name that does not particularly read Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so I've been receiving a lot of mail regarding it. I treat it seriously. I've reported to museums that I work with, etc. But I fundamentally also, the congressman was talking about the idea that you do get a little inured to it. And he only really engages with it when it becomes something that's really serious. I've gotten a couple that are really frightening, and I engage with those. But for the most part, the thing that made me think about a lot, more than anything else really, is about the idea of education on the topic. I do a lot of work with museums. I do a lot of work with Jewish and Holocaust museums. I've been to what I'm going to call secondary and tertiary market museums, where they have to devote a lot of their floor space to the basic educational premise of, well, welcome to our museum, group of school kids in Kansas. Let's start with, what is a Jew? Which is something that if you're outside of these sort of primary markets or places where there's big populations, they're not aware of. So fundamentally, when I get this mail, the first thing I always think of is not necessarily, are they going to hurt me? Because if they were going to hurt me, they wouldn't have written to me first. My first question is, how would this person have benefited if perhaps they had gotten a little more education about, well, what is this topic? Why is a book about how Jews are Americans not an offensive idea? Why is a book about how American plurality and inclusion is not an offensive idea? So for me, it always comes back to not necessarily being afraid of these folks, but wishing something better for them or for the folks who come after them. I think it's a problem you can get ahead of in a country that has a robust infrastructure and can restart these conversations through educational initiatives.
Excellent. Again, thank you. It's all about education. I know.
I sense the congressman has a thought.
No, I apologize. I unfortunately have to go. I think you hit the nail on the head. And, on the education piece, I've got the HEAL Act, which is a piece of legislation to make sure that we actually we figure out, are we teaching about the Holocaust nationally? What are we teaching? An audit, right? Because as you know, in a lot of places, just mentioning the Holocaust checks the box, saying Holocaust, the word Holocaust, and then you're done, right? So, are you actually teaching about it? In a lot of places around the country, there's zero mention of it. And then as we get further and further away from people who are from survivors, we know what happens in terms of people questioning the facts, not even knowing what it is. And then you see the ramifications of what could happen. That I unfortunately have to go to committee. But Eric, yes. I'd love to see you again. And Dan and BA, thank you so much for what you do. I apologize. I'm so sorry about today.
Totally understand. Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah.
So Dan, speaking about education, educating again about Judaism, about the Jewish existence, about the Holocaust, that's something, of course, that's near and dear, based on your and your family's recent renaming of your Jewish day school, where you grew up. That's Alma Schechter School down in Marlborough, New Jersey. Do you want to speak to, or can you speak to, what BA was saying in terms of how the Jewish day school down, that's Alma Schechter down in Marlborough, is going to make it a priority to equip the students with knowledge on how to combat some of the ignorance, which is the cause for some of the anti-Semitism around the country?
Yeah, sure. I think if you look over history and you study all of these events that look and feel like the Holocaust, whether it be the Holocaust, genocide in Rwanda, and so on, they all kind of follow a similar pattern, which is there is a disruption and delocation in the economy for some reason. there is a person or persons that pit groups against one another and typically chooses a scapegoat. They dehumanize those people with stereotypical tropes. And once that dehumanization kicks in, then the physical erosion and harm becomes a hell of a lot easier. And that's like, again, that pattern exists throughout all of history for these situations. And so the way you, I think, combat any of those things is with information. And there's, two ways to think about information, or good or bad information. One is more of it, more free speech, more education, more awareness. And the other is censorship and the suppression of ideas and information. And I think, over a long enough time period, what's proven to be true is that like suppression of ideas doesn't get very far. And instead what happens is a lot of kind of whack-a-mole. You take some of the big tech platforms, what they've done over the past few years as an example of trying to censor things. Well, they don't really go away. They just fester. And in fact, I think in some cases it's worse because now these ideas go to dark corners of the earth and manifest and become even bolder and more emblazoned and come back in bigger, scarier kind of form. So I don't know that like censorship per se is the right idea. I do think and believe instead education is the right idea. I mean, we just touched on this, but there's plenty of people around the country and world that in the case of anti-Semitism and Jews, like people don't know what a Jew is. They don't know what the Holocaust is. They don't know what it is all about. They don't have those facts. And I believe if more people did have that information, then I think a lot of the issues we see today, whether it be anti-Semitism or racism, whatever, would not be as bad. And I think it's human nature to be afraid of what you don't understand and to look for scapegoats and to point. But I think ultimately more light kind of cures darkness, right? And I think that comes in the form of education. And so, yeah, part of why I got more involved in the Jewish day school that I grew up in is like kids are the future, not just in Judaism, but forever, right? And so the more we can equip kids at a young age with history and things that have happened, the more equipped they are to ensure it doesn't happen again. And I think that's really where it has to start, is with education and with kids. And if not just kids, but really everybody. So the legislation that Congressman was talking about in terms of ensuring that this education happens more ubiquitously, I think is fantastic and necessary, because without it, then you're going to have a lot of very uneducated, very ignorant people just regurgitating the same old tropes and stereotypes that when you click the fast forward button and you layer on what's happening in the economy and dislocation and so on, to me, it's very easy to see and imagine never again being again. And I know people don't like believe that it's true, but history rhymes and repeats itself. And we know this for fact and for certain. And again, so I think the way you combat that is with education, and that's something that's important that we need more of.
Excellent. And yes, please.
If I can add to that a little bit, talking about the idea of education, I think that it's important. So I think there's two aspects of education that are important to this. The first is the one that Dan was just talking about, which is the idea that kids at the Jewish day school that he's affiliated with learn about what's happened in the past, try and avoid it for the future, know to be vigilant against it. I think the second part of it is the opposite of that, which is the person who is going to school in some little town in Nebraska. The mail that I get, it's not coming from kids who went to the Jewish day school. It's coming from people who live in Hot Springs, Arkansas. It's coming from folks who live in Georgia. It's coming from folks who live in Yemen. It's coming from places where they are not familiar with these stories from an insider's perspective. And what's really important is this is a pattern we've seen not just with Jews, but with many different groups throughout the history of the universe. Humans are tribal, right? And the easiest sale to make in the entire world is your problems are their fault, and pick some nebulous they, and not knowing the they is really important to the situation. If you know a lot of Mexican Americans, they're no longer Mexicans, they're no longer illegals, they're suddenly Pete and George and whatever it might be, they become people. fundamentally, if you are just viewing it through the lens of there's this evil cabal of Jews hanging out at the bagel store plotting the destruction of the universe, it's not really going to seem that far-fetched to you because you don't really know what that history's about. You don't know what those people are about. And I say those because they still remain them to you. I just finished doing this where I actually think that most of the angry mail I got was because I told the stories as American stories. I didn't tell them particularly as Jewish stories. I didn't tell them particularly as other stories. The word Jewish doesn't appear a ton in it. The word Holocaust doesn't appear a ton in it. It's all about how these folks came to America. They chose the harder path of citizenship in life. They picked a place where they were aliens, they were strangers in a strange land, and they became really the definition of what Americans can be. And that's the threatening concept. The threat is when the others cease to be others. And that is something that you do through education. It's the only way. It's about taking those kids who are in X town or Y village and introducing them to Holocaust survivors, introducing them to, well, what is Judaism about? What is Islam about? What do Muslims contribute to America? What do Mexicans contribute to America? What do Jews contribute to America? That's where it becomes the idea of America that threatens these folks. Because fundamentally, if you grow up thinking something perhaps differently than your parents did or your grandparents did, that starts to change things.
Yeah. So
if I get one thought down, I just want to point out that Eric and I grew up together. That's how we know each other, and we grew up in a kind of a really working class neighborhood where I guarantee you most of the folks that we grew up around don't think the way that we do.
No.
At all. And that is because, and I could name them and I won't, that is because of education. That's because we were taught differently. So that's where I think the real chance for progress is. I'm sorry for cutting you off, Dan.
Yeah, no, it's a really great point because like what you're getting at is this idea of education and demystifying who these people are, what they're about, how they think. And, I agree with you. It's like option D, all of the above in terms of combating this. But just as an example, just yesterday, I was at the school. We were doing a dedication ceremony, donating an ambu cycle to United Hatzalah. It's Israel's emergency response first responder division that's completely based on volunteers, and they're global. And so when the earthquakes happened in Turkey and Syria, they deployed many first responders over there to help rescue folks. They sent many chartered private jets to fly people to be first on scene. And, there's a video I saw of a Syrian person who is saying, Allah Akbar, thank God the Jews are here helping us, which in terms of stereotypes, I think many people, when they hear that, would think this is something that is said before Jews are being attacked or killed. And it's portrayed that way often in even movies. But when you have people out there in the real world doing real work for good, then I think that experience firsthand helps to demystify who, these Jewish people are. And like most humans, I believe most humans are good people, but just when you don't have that exposure or education to others that don't look and feel like us, it's very easy to think of everybody as bad or different or as spooky. And so again, that's why I think education to Dia's point, not just with the Jewish groups, but exposure and education to the people that don't know about it are both equally important and critical for any of us to get better or improve.
I mean, I've been a journalist for 22 years. I've been to 102 countries, and people are like all over. The things that fathers in Syria want and fathers in Jewish families in Jerusalem want are the exact same things. It's true everywhere. The differences between people aren't really that large. Where they grow large is when people are told that they're different. When they're told that somebody wants something very different from what you want. When somebody has unlimited greed and unlimited X or Y or Z. When in reality, folks want a life that's a little easier tomorrow than it was yesterday. They want their kids to have comfort and safety. They want for the water to come out of the faucet. That's what people want. And nobody's really waking up and going, oh, well, today I really want to go and bomb X, Y, and Z. Something drives them to that point.
Yeah, it's 100% true. Again, it's rooted in at least it starts in ignorance. But again, once we make that
Mm-hmm.
proactive attempt to educate, at least hopefully on a one-to-one basis, on who these, again, demystifying. I think that's the word that Dan used to speak to BA's point. Demystify who these people are, and understand that there's a lot more similar than different. Then there's more harmony. There's more of, we're in this together, instead of actually you're the root cause of why I'm XYZ, why I feel slighted, why I feel disenfranchised,
Mm-hmm.
why I feel marginalized here in society,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate. Again, to BA's point, everyone, more or less, you ask people from different groups what they want. Again, it's going to sound more or less the same. I have similar aspirations. I want the family. I want the job. I want to be educated. I want to give my kids what I didn't have, or give them a better life. So I think it starts, especially, anti-Semitism. Again, this broader conversation, which I love that we're having, yes, it's anti-Semitism, which is part and parcel, hatred towards a group, the Jews, but there's also animus towards other groups. It all starts to get this foundation of being able to educate who these people are, and how they're not, and again, how they're not so different. I think is terribly important. And I appreciate the Congressman's sponsoring of the HEAL Act to make Holocaust education wherever you live in the United States mandatory. And it's not just, again, checking the box. It's really understanding what the Holocaust is about, and who it affected and impacted. I know we're running up on time. Would love to get both of your parting, let's say, words in terms of encouragement from this conversation for the people who are listening at home on how they can help. I know we've talked about ways of combating anti-Semitism, and again, it's more that broader. How do we prevent and stamp out hatred in all its forms? So I'd love to start with you, Dan. Just based on your experience, what have you found to be most successful? Again, you mentioned education, but are there any other sort of strategies that you would suggest?
Yeah, I think for me, actions speak louder than words, but certainly words matter. There are plenty of people that that I follow and admire on social media who are basically like social media warriors combating anti-Semitism online, and I've actually supported a bunch of them because I think that's necessary. But then, then there's other not more active, other ways to participate. For example, donating to and getting involved with like United Hatzalah to not only save lives, but have the world see that Jewish people are people that are genuinely trying to do good in the world. I think organizations like that, or getting involved with them, is great. And there are tons of them out there. So I think doing something is way better than doing nothing. And if everybody, Jews, non-Jews included, for anything combating hate, racism, if people can just do one thing, one way to get involved, you add all of those things up, and I think it's a pretty meaningful difference. And it starts with conversations like these to hopefully encourage others to get more active, however
Excellent.
They see fit.
Excellent. BA?
I say this with the huge asterisk of having published 4 or 5 days ago a giant editorial about how I get hate mail every day. But I generally am optimistic, again with that asterisk, because I agree with something that Martin Luther King said years ago, which is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And we now live in a time where the world grows smaller daily. We live in a time where everybody gets to have an opinion. We don't have to agree with them. Everyone's talking all the time. They're making 140 character analysis of the universe at all times. And I think fundamentally that sort of open conversation, even if it invites in bad actors, even if it invites in plenty and plenty of idiots, also gives a forum for folks who know better. And I think that's really, really important. I have a person who's sort of been keeping track of the social media stuff that's gone on me lately, and most of it's positive. Some of it's very negative, most of it's very positive. I think that's true probably for any topic if you're talking about anti-Semitism, right? You're always going to get a few idiots. You're going, oh, well, the people we put in parentheses, the vague yarmulke-wearing evil bots of the world, well, they're out there. But also there's lots of folks who are saying, well, actually, no, let's talk about that, because the guy who lives next door to you is also Jewish, and he's a nice guy, and you let his wife babysit your kids sometimes. Fundamentally, that is the larger conversation. You're also seeing, more positive, or I'm going to depictions of Jewish culture in media. And by media, I don't mean the news. I mean things like Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, right? We're talking about these larger conversations again as being stories that are sort of contemporary to our culture and closer to us than they'd ever been before. It's not this unapproachable thing. Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is coming out very soon, as I understand it. I happened to watch the other day The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, the very first talkie, and it's an incredibly Jewish story. There's cantors and there's rabbis, and it opens with them singing Kol Nidre, and it has Yom Kippur at both ends of it. And we've gotten from these sort of esoteric fetishist depictions to being, it's the person next door who works the comedy circuit. And I think that's a really important distinction that's happened in the culture. Generally speaking, we are othering people less and giving agency more and more to folks that we're depicting, and that's true also for Jewish folks. So even if that education that I want, that you want, isn't happening as fast, quickly as we want it, fundamentally they're still getting educated in other ways. So, sorry, 1,000 words I could have used too, but fundamentally I remain cautiously optimistic.
Dan, do you share that same sentiment? Fundamentally optimistic or cautiously fundamentally optimistic?
Yeah, I think all humans are generally and genuinely good people, but that takes work. It takes education and work. And if you're complacent, then really bad things that we've seen before can happen all over again. I think, Eric, you noticed my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. When I had conversations with them about their experience when they were living in Poland, it was really no different than our lives today, right? There was a temperature that was rising in terms of anti-Semitism and rhetoric from a group of people in a country not even their own. But everything was fine and well until literally one day it was not. And then one day their country was invaded, and my grandfather was rounded up by SS officers and he thankfully escaped what he found out later was a Nazi death march, and the 10 others that he was marching with, he found dead in a ditch, executed, gun to their heads. He would have never, and I know it's because he's told me, would never fathom that could have happened ever, even with all of the politics that were happening in Germany, and yet it did. And so if we're not vigilant and if we are complacent, then certainly those things can happen, but on balance and on margin, I think to BA's point, I think we're all generally good people. We all have the same hopes, dreams, and wishes that every other human does. And more of that needs to be highlighted and focused on. And I think the more that happens, the less the other negative stuff happens. And by the way, that there's a role to play here in terms of government and politics too, which is why, if you look at elections all over the world, I think people with good moral character and are real leaders that can be uniters and not dividers makes a big difference, because it adds to the national and global rhetoric that people latch onto. So in short, I'm genuinely optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Genuinely and generally optimistic, cautiously optimistic. I can share in that sentiment. To build on Dan's point, just remaining vigilant. Not allowing some of these this particular conversation and the topic of racism and hatred to fall to the periphery. Even though it's not happening perhaps in your backyard, it's still very important. We're a community. We look out for one another. We're humans. Again, we share, similar, aspirations, dreams, goals, hopes. And hopefully coming out of this conversation for the people at home who are going to be watching, I'm confident that you're taking away some key insights on how you can join this conversation. And again, making it or moving it from the periphery to the fore as an important conversation to have, whether that's on social media or whether that's having it at the dinner table. I think we can all, hopefully we can all agree that social media, unfortunately, has created an echo chamber, has put people in opposite corners at times. But having these types of conversations, hopefully breaks that echo chamber to understand that there are, again, people that you may not interact with online who are no different than you. So again, I appreciate Dan and BA's time this morning, Congressman Gottheimer for his time and for his insights and sharing some of the firsthand experience of the legislation that he's pushing forward to, again, help with Holocaust education across the United States, to using Dan's word, to make it more ubiquitous. So Dan, BA, again, thank you very much. And this conversation will go live shortly. Call notes in terms of where to follow Dan, BA, and Congressman Gottheimer, as well as your organization like United Hatzalah, where you can find out more information if you want to get involved. I'll include some other organizations that, again, are part of this fight against anti-Semitism or combating anti-Semitism. So, again, great conversation, and we'll talk to everyone soon.